My name is Sebastian, and in this video I'm going to show you 5 ways how to debug your JVM Quarkus application. Because if you're using Quarkus, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the dev mode, and that in it of itself is already super helpful, but sometimes you also want to use the debug functionality. So what does that mean? Let's go to some Quarkus playground project that I've created. It's actually very simple. It just has some sort of hello world controller where we say, okay, it can say hello, but also with some parameter, which I can show you in a second. So if we're going to build this and run it using Quarkus dev, which is probably what you're familiar with if you have tried out Quarkus, then what we can do, we can say, okay, curl localhost hello, and it will tell us hello, or we can say hello / something, and it will tell us hello, for example, Quarkus. Okay, cool. So that's very simple. But now how to debug this? Of course, a way would be to go into the code and say, if I want to check out that parameter here, for example, I could go and say, please, debug whatever we have here. And since we use Quarkus, it just reloads so quickly that this is often just helpful already, that we say, hey, just gonna print it because I have this locally running in development mode. And that's just a very easy way to go. But in many ways, this is not quite sophisticated enough. Sometimes we really need a proper debugger, and our IDE of choice should be our friend here to actually look into it and debug what's going on. Okay, so if you're using the dev mode, that's the first part that I want to show you. Debugging is super simple. We just need to connect to the debug port that is already running here. So if you have a look at the log, it will tell you somewhere that it is actually listening for, I cannot find it right now, listening for a debug, here, for port 5005. This is the default remote debug port in a JVM. What does that mean? Well, it actually listens to this port. If I go to localhost 5005, I can connect to it using, well, a debugging tool. So of course, in all the examples, I'm going to show you my IDE here. I'm using IntelliJ. You could use any other tool. I mean, you could even use the JDB debug tool on the command line, but in all my years in using Java, I have not met a person who actually does this. If you ever use this tool, let me know in the comments down below, but I don't think so. So of course we want to use a proper IDE, and I use my IntelliJ here. How is this working? I can add a debug configuration where we make a localhost remote debug. Okay, let me remove this again and show you how to add it. If you have a debug configuration, you can just go to remote debug or put in remote JVM debug. I usually call this something like localhost or localhost with the port in case I have multiple ones. It attaches to a remote JVM. So if you want to run this, and I'll show this in a second for the next examples, if you want to run this plain in your command line, this will be the command line arguments, or I just add the port. Quarkus starts the debugging with 5005, so that's enough. We just say debug, and it actually is connected. And then we see that it has the proper connection of the code once we set a breakpoint. And now it does the check mark on our breakpoint. So it sees actually it is connected to my VM, and it also has a breakpoint, and it's sort of active. It's connected to the code. And now if I invoke something, for example, hello, I think the Quarkus one I did, now it captures it, and here I'm in my IDE. So now I can step through, and I see also, okay, what is the name here, things like that. I can evaluate an expression. I can say, okay, Quarkus to lowercase gives me that, substring, things like that. So you can actually try out things and look into whatever you want to debug. This is especially helpful if you have more complex data structures where you have lists of a lot of things and you just want to see what you got. Okay, but then of course we could also go further into our code and step through what's happening here. So for example, I have a CDI bean that is then invoked. It sometimes depends if you invoke the code directly, because now if I'm going to step into, that is F7, then it doesn't end up at your hello immediately. Why? Because of the Quarkus code that does the inversion of control in CDI in the injection. So you can step to that port actually where you're going to invoke the code, or my recommendation is to set just another breakpoint and then say resume until you hit the next breakpoint F9, and then you actually hear in that method. So sometimes you have to consider what is the best way here, and then in the same way you can just have a look again. Okay, now if we fully continue, then it actually returns and I have the request fulfilled. So this is the first way how to debug using Quarkus Dev. It's very simple. Why? Because it starts just out of the box. I didn't have to do anything else. Just say Maven Quarkus Dev and that's it. I can change the debug port. For example, for some reason, if the debug port collides 5005, I have something running on localhost, I can change that, or I can fully disable it for any other reason. So if I change it to 5006, it will tell me, okay, now that's a different port listening. And if I were about to restart the same thing, then of course now I get the connection refused. I have to change the port. So sometimes I do that if I have multiple things running, or a more complex setup with multiple applications that I can debug at the same time. That will be the way to go. Okay. Of course, for debugging, I don't only have to invoke it somewhere in the command line or the browser. I can also do this in the IDE, which is what I'm sometimes doing if I'm debugging a more sophisticated test scenario. So for example, I have an integration test here that invokes my hello using some Java code here. You can check this out on GitHub, where I say, okay, please invoke this with a test. So I can just invoke this here, run this test, and then it checks that, it checks hello world. Okay, now if I do this plus the debug, so what I'm going to do, I start the debug again, not debugging the test, but I run now two processes in my IDE. One is the remote debug here, and the other is then running the test. This works. I can run both at the same time. So now in my run window, you saw this real quick. I can check it and switch it with Alt 4. That's the run window. Now that's just spinning and waiting. And Alt 5, it's the debug window. Now in a separate process here, I'm in the debug mode in the captured breakpoint. And here I can again debug it, what has been invoked from my system test. So that can be quite helpful if you already have a test scenario that invokes something, so you can capture that and catch the breakpoint. Okay, cool. That was the first way using Quarkus Dev, very straightforward. If for some reason you want to debug an already built application, so you have packaged something using Quarkus, you have a jar file that you want to execute and you want to debug that, how to do this? Well, very simple. This works as always in Java. You need to add a specific string to your java-jar run configuration and then go from there. So what does that mean? Let's build our application real quick. Maven clean package. This will just build our default java-jar runnable application. So if I want to run this Quarkus run.jar, okay, I can run it and invoke it, then 8080, hello Quarkus, perfect. Now that's already built. Now why would you say, why do you need this if I have it locally? Well, it depends. Sometimes, for example, if you run a command line application with Quarkus, you don't want to run it in debug mode, or you can't, or you run it on a different system. There might be a lot of reasons for that. How to debug this now? Well, this also works. This is actually the sort of straightforward way how to do the remote JVM debug. Here you see the command line arguments that it told you to basically add here using that port 5005. That's what you add for the Java command. So let's do this. Before the -jar, we add, and I usually like to do this in quotes because of the star and everything, we add agent lib for transport and server suspend, yes or no. That's that. Depends what you want. And then the address. Suspending means if I were to suspend this, it wouldn't even start the application until a remote debug is connected. This can be helpful if you want to debug something like an init process, like your post-construct method or something like this. So then it doesn't do anything. It just says, okay, it listens to 5005. And now once I connect my IDE again to my remote debug, localhost 5005, then it will actually continue and start up Quarkus. So that is the difference. Suspend no would also work, then it was just start up and you can still attach to it later. Okay, Now let's try this, if that actually works. I'm gonna set the breakpoint here again. Hello, say hello. And now if I invoke this, now it's gonna catch that. Now for this, you just need to make sure that your code in the IDE and also what you've built is up to date. So sometimes if that doesn't match, then you cannot have the breakpoint. So you see this, the check mark needs to be there once the debug is active. And if not, just rebuild and make sure you're actually debugging the right thing. Because now the java-jar, it doesn't have to be even in the same directory. It's just a jar file that then you execute using that debug string here. So that's how this works. You can, of course, again, change the port and anything and then connect to it. So that's the second way, using a local java-jar that you can debug using this way and connecting your IDE. Okay, perfect. Now it's getting more interesting. The third way is to do this in Docker containers. And that's going to be more interesting. I'm just showing you containers here in order to have something like a remote system, even though it's on my same local machine. But that already includes a lot of other options where you say, for example, you need to debug a situation where you're in a certain environment and you need to make sure that, well, you are in this environment, maybe because of some test reasons, maybe because of some other systems that are involved that you need to check. So this happens quite often. And how to do this? Okay, basically in the same way what we've just seen. So we can just say, okay, please build the application in a normal way, Maven clean package, and then run it in a Docker container. For that, we need a Docker image. I have one example here using JDK 17 with Temurin, that's OpenJ9. And I have this normal way of running Quarkus in just this opinionated way. But you can use any other Docker file that you want. You can use the one shipped with Quarkus with the code.quarkus.io, whatever you like. So I'm going to build this into an image called app. And now I can run this, Docker run, with port 888, Docker run, no, Docker run, my shell aliases. I run this here, so now my application runs and I can connect to it, 88, and say, okay, please, say hello. Okay, this doesn't add the debug just yet because this is just running my application now in a Docker container, but how to add the debug information? Well, actually in the same way what we just had before, we just need to add that string to this java-jar command. So if we say here internally, we're gonna run a certain command, this one, then we need to add this for, well, whatever we would like to have here. For example, running this java-jar, I can override this, for example. I can run a different command. I can override this actually here at runtime. I don't even need to rebuild the image. Sometimes you can also set an environment variable, something like Java debug enable or enable debug. There are different ways, but this is specific to your package JVM inside the Docker base image. So it depends what you can do here. This depends on your image. I'm going to show you the plain way how to do it, to just override the java-jar command, and then the rest is implementation specific to whatever image you would like to have. Okay, one thing after another. Let's just add the JVM attach string again. Let's say, okay, now that's going to be a longer command. Please run this again, -jar. The jar, now that's inside my Docker container, obviously. This will be deployments Quarkus run. This should already be, for my purposes, sufficient. And now, of course, what we need to add another port. Why? Because then afterwards, just because of this, it doesn't add localhost 5005, but whatever or however you connect to your Docker container. So now I'm going to publish that port to localhost 5005 that I can actually access it. So now what does it do? Now I didn't do the suspend. Now suspend, no, we could add the suspend as well. Now it's going to listening to that port. And now I could go to my IDE again and say, okay, please connect it. Why does it work? Because I mapped the port. So just to double check, if I stop this again, it's disconnected and I cannot connect again. So it was only the port started from the Docker container. Now let's reconnect. Let's set a breakpoint here. It's connected, check mark, great. I say hello Quarkus and then I'm there. And now the connection is to the Docker container using that mapped port 5005, and it's running in the Docker container. So locally I don't have anything running, just my my curl and the connection to the IDE, and it's executing the code inside the container. So that's pretty cool, and I will show you some more examples there, how to connect this in a remote system in a second, because that is often needed in some environment. Okay, cool. Let's, that was the wrong one. Let's connect this. And that's this. Let's stop that again. That was how to run a debug with java-jar inside a Docker container. Now it's getting even more interesting. There is a way to run a whole Maven remote dev mode from Quarkus inside a remote system, for example, a Docker container. I was showing that in a previous video, and this is getting more interesting. This is technically not only debugging, because then it's a whole dev mode where I can change code also into a different system. So that's cool in it of itself already, so in a different way. But of course you can also do just a plain debug. How does this work? The remote dev, and this is also then explained on the guides, so you can have a look at that remote dev in some ways. Basically what it means that you have Quarkus running not necessarily locally, but on some other system, and you're doing not just the java-jar execution, but the whole Quarkus dev on a system. This is of course only for testing purposes, but we can say something like Maven clean package, and for that we need to change the package type. The way how to do this is package jar type mutable jar. So we're going to package this as what is called a mutable jar, just to enable that we can actually change the this whole thing at runtime. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to still build the Docker image. I'm going to rebuild this now because it's a different application. Why am I using this with Docker? Well, otherwise it doesn't make sense. So I could do this locally, but then it's technically not really a remote dev. It still works, but you know, of course it should run on a different system. I also could now use a different computer, but I want to show this using Docker. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I now want to execute this in my Docker image. Okay, let's, or in a Docker container. Let's do it one by one. 80. Let's run my application again, app. Okay, and now I can say, please run this. And then for that way, I need to set certain parameters. For example, I can say, just to have them again, Java. Let's add this already, java-jar, and then I say here it's Quarkus live reload password, for example 123, and URL, that's per default my application URL 8080. You can check this out on the Quarkus guides how to set these things. I can change them, and then I'm going to execute this. Now what it will do, it will actually start up this application. Now it will start up in the same way. Why? Because I have to set an environment variable. This works both locally and in my Docker container. That is called Quarkus launch dev mode true. This only works because of our mutable jar. And then what it does, now you see this, kind of interesting, it starts the dev mode, but that's inside a container. If I actually, let me stop this again, run it with docker run-ti for TTY and interactive, that you actually see, now it's having some nicer colors. And this looks like a dev mode, but it's actually inside a Docker container. So that's pretty cool. I can also use use the keyboard here and say, okay, for example, restart with S. Nice. So that runs inside Docker. First of all, that's something like Quarkus dev in a Docker container, launch the dev mode. And now the second part of it is to connect to it. So now I go to my Quarkus playground repository again, and I say, okay, Maven, not Quarkus dev, but Quarkus remote dev. similar what you just saw in the guides here. I can say, okay, please connect to that specific live reload URL, localhost 8080, and then the live reload password, what we just set, is, well, just 123. We don't care that much about that. And then disable the debug just for now. And then what it does, it will actually try connect to that using immutable jar package type. 1 second, I think that's what I've done when launching the server. Yes, Quarkus launch dev mode true. No, 1 second. I think I've started it with this way. Let's double check to be sure. So this should run my app Java in the specific debug live reload password. That should be that. Just to be sure, let's run this again. Quarkus package jar type. Just double checking that I don't have a typo. Otherwise, it would also tell me here. Let's rebuild the application. And then let's start it again. Okay. Dev mode active. So here we need to also add the package type, package jar type mutable jar. You can set these things here on the command line, or you add them to your properties. That also works. Live reload password debug false. So now this should connect, and here you see, okay, now it's connected, and it has been connected here to the application, to my dev application that runs in the Docker container. Now if I connect to 8080 hello, or hello Quarkus again, then it says hello Quarkus, okay. And now I can actually connect to it if I set the debug string, or I say I actually change something. That also works. So if I say, for example, hello name exclamation mark, I can run this again, and then it will actually change something like a dev mode using the running application here in the dev mode. So it will restart this. Okay, cool. Now let's see if I added the debug string. So that's that. Java-jar with the debug string, again 5005, suspend no. I also added now the debug port 5005 from the Docker container so that we can connect to the Docker container, which is also why in the remote dev here I say debug false. Obviously, otherwise the ports would collide, or I need to change the port here. So let's start this and start that again. Now I started it in the same way, just with the debug string. So now this reload should still work. If I say hello Quarkus question mark, okay, cool. Now I set the breakpoint and I connect to localhost 5005. Now I'm connected again to the Docker container. And now if I run this again, I'm actually here. That has been started in the Docker container, but now with the Quarkus dev mode. So this is sort of the most complex way to run this. Now we're running remote dev with a launched dev mode inside a Docker container. It could be somewhere else on a different system. So you not only can connect to it with regards to debugging, but also with the dev mode that I can actually change code on a differently running system. But technically that's also debugging. Okay, cool. So that was a sophisticated way to run this. And now the fifth way and last way that I want to show you is to how to debug it specifically in a Kubernetes environment. How to do it, you basically already know it. If you paid attention, it's the same way like to run this in a Docker container. But just to show you that, of course, it also works in a Kubernetes setup. We can say I have a Kubernetes cluster running here with, well, no pods, nothing running for now. And I have an example that I can show you using basically a deployment for my application that deploys everything, that then will be packaged to a different Docker registry, which I have to do now in a second. And then I can run this on my Kubernetes cluster. How does this work? Well, quite straightforward. Now what I will show you is, again, to debug in the normal Java jar way. Also, the remote dev works as well, so you can combine this. But now I'm showing you the Java way how to do this. I rebuilt my application, even clean package. I'm rebuilding my image, but now I already call it with my personal registry. Why? Because I need to upload and push it in order that Kubernetes can pull it again, obviously, because then I'm not necessarily on a local system. So I say, please rebuild it and then push it to my repository, call this app or hello world. And this is then what I'm going to run inside Kubernetes. So basically then I can say, great, please deploy my application now. Let's do this real quick. I go to Kubernetes, say kubectl apply, everything that is in deployment. So then it should create a service for hello world and a deployment, and of course have a pod. So that pod is already running. Let's have a look at the logs here. Hello world, we see, okay, cool, that is running in the prod mode 8080. Cool. So that means I can connect, well, not to local host, of course, but to however my Kubernetes cluster is set up. For me, that's that specific local IP/hello or hello something. And then it tells me, okay, that is my code. Cool. That runs in Kubernetes. How to debug this now? Well, basically in the same way that we've seen. So I can go and say, okay, now what do we run here? And now this depends how you want to start that debug mode. Of course, in Kubernetes, we can set environment variables here at config time, similar to what you can do with Docker run. So I can, for example, say, okay, please add an environment variable. Again, some of the JVMs or JVM distributions allow Java enable debug or something like this to be set to true. So this would be a way to do this. I'm showing you the more generic way, where I say, okay, please just change the command that we're running. And I'm now just copy and pasting the command from my Docker file. I say, okay, this is what we should execute. Plus, now again, the connection string from my local debug or remote debug, which says, again, suspend no 5005. Okay, cool. So then we will be able to connect to that. How we do this, I'll show you in a second. Basically, now I change this on the fly, which is okay for my purposes. I can say, please redeploy this. And then what it will do, or what I would expect, that it actually starts a new pod. Why? Because we changed the configuration here. And now what it should do, it should tell me in the log, okay, that actually can connect to with 5005. Now that's going to be interesting how to do this, because of course that's not localhost 5005, that's in my Kubernetes cluster. So of course you could go and say, well, please add a service and some ingress or Istio routing to it, but that's probably not the best way. There is a nice Kubernetes feature to do this instead, that is called port forward. So we can say, please forward a local host port to a pod, for example 5005, where I say kubectl port forward for my hello world pod 5005:5005, and now that's forwarding this to localhost. And now again I can go to my IDE and say debug localhost 5005, which is now connecting to my Kubernetes cluster, and then I can say please curl this again. If you set a breakpoint, we'll see that the breakpoint is connected. Let's do this again, and now it captures the debug that actually now goes into my Kubernetes cluster, because it's connected with that debug port 5005, and I changed the run configuration that it actually runs with that debug string. Same thing would work with the remote dev, that what we've seen before. Same thing would work in any other way. For example, if you set it by environment variable, maybe you want to change your Docker file, etc., etc. But that's basically how it works from a technical perspective, and then you can change that. Okay, so these were now 5 ways how to debug your JVM Quarkus applications. Let me know in the comments what is typically the way how you do it, how your development workflow looks like. If you're more interested in Quarkus development, I have video courses on this topic, linked down below in the description. And I hope this was helpful and entertaining. And as always, thanks a lot for watching. Bye.